Alright, hello everybody, welcome to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Weaver, one of the most versatile hunters inside of Steel Hunters. In this video, we're going to be covering the different systems, mods, as well as best companions you can use with Weaver in order to maximize his overall output potential, and we're also going to be talking about how to play this hunter in order to make him as dangerous as possible inside of the battlefield. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into it. Okay, so without that out of the way, let's look into Weaver's system. So first of all, we're going to be looking at his guns. So the main guns he has access to are Venom, and then we also have Astute. So Venom is an automatic, it turns Weaver's gun into an automatic gun with 18 bullets, I believe. This gun has the ability to apply a DOT effect that deals damage over time to hunters, and it can stack up to 5 times. What this DOT effect does essentially, apart from dealing damage, it also prevents hunters from activating abilities or any sort of resource whilst being burned, which turns Weaver into a more aggressive hunter, right? If you want to play more aggressively, make more plays, this is definitely the system you're going to be running. It also increases the damage by a certain percentage after a successful quick reload. And then lastly, there is a chance of you restoring structure points up to a certain percentage, depending on the level of your hunter, out of the DOT effect you apply. So the DOT effect doesn't only deal damage to the opponent, but it also heals a certain amount to you. Now, personally, I would recommend you actually play with Astute. Now, what Astute does is it turns the gun into a 3-bullet burst gun, and it increases the ammo regeneration speed, it reduces scatter, and increases the magazine size to 21 once you reach the third passive. Now, I know that on paper it sounds like Venom is the better ability, but the main reason Astute is better is simply because realistically, most people are not going to stand in front of you and allow you to apply that DOT effect. If you start shooting someone with Weaver or any hunter per se, most people are going to take cover, which means that you're not going to be able to take advantage of the full potential of Venom. On the other side, Astute, since it's a burst gun ability, as long as you aim your shots right, you will always land those 3 shots, which means that depending on the level, you're going to be dealing between 2,000 to 4,000 damage per burst, which is way more than you're going to be dealing with Venom, right? And this is based on a burst. We're not talking about the full clip. The overall damage potential of Astute is extremely high, especially early games, since Venom doesn't even unlock its passives. And I think overall it's just the most versatile system you can have for the gun. So that's going to be the guns for now. Then we're going to have Mainframe. For Mainframe, we're going to have access to Skater or Cocoon. Skater is the one I recommend. It's the more versatile, the more aggressive system. Essentially what it does is every 10 hits with a minigun on a hunter, it will reduce the cooldown on your barriers. So essentially it just, gives you better cycle through your abilities, which is an extremely valuable passive to have on any hunter in general, especially one like Weaver that has very long cooldowns. It reduces incoming damage whilst your barrier is up, which is also very, very good. Obviously, your barrier has vulnerabilities. People can push you and try to flank you, essentially, making the barrier useless. But you will still take less damage, or if for some reason you have to evacuate your barrier, disengage, you'll take less damage whilst retreating. And then lastly, the other one, which is the most important passive, is the ability to jump and dash whilst minigun is up. For those of you who do not know, once minigun is activated, Weaver becomes very immobile. You lose a lot of movement speed, and normally you can dash or jump, meaning that if you activate minigun, it is very easy for hunters to disengage you. But if you have this passive, you can still roll around, you can still jump around, allowing you to chase them down and take more advantage of the minigun. Cocoon, on the other side, which I do think is also viable, makes it so that your shield recharge is decreased. It also improves repair kit effectiveness and grants critical hit resistance whilst your shield is active. We're not talking about the barrier, but the shield. This one is actually pretty decent too. It essentially just makes it so that your minigun is less of a threat, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Having good sustain is extremely useful, especially in endgames when resources start running low. The only reason I'd recommend Skater yet again is because it just makes minigun that much more threatening, and it allows you to make more plays, right? Cocoon is always just going to be a defensive system. Then for the barriers, we're going to have access to Assess and the Conundrum. A very big difference between Assess and Conundrums, besides the passives, is that Assess gives you access to 2 barriers. So essentially, Weaver's going to have 2 barriers on stock, so you can deploy either or. You can deploy them simultaneously though, so if you deploy a barrier and then you deploy a secondary, the primary one will get destroyed, and you'll only be left with secondary one, so you can't just make a house in the middle of the map. But it is still very nice because it means that if your primary barrier gets destroyed or you get flanked and engaged from another side, you still have access to another barrier. On the other hand though, Conundrum only has access to 1 bigger barrier, and yeah, that's kind of it. As for the passives though, the reason I recommend Assess is because, well, it restores 50 barrier points per second. That's not that much, to be fully honest, but it means that if your opponent stop shooting at the barrier, it will start healing, it pretty much forces opponents to either commit all of their resources to destroying the barrier or ignoring it. It spawns a pylon that increases your and your teammates' damage output as long as you're in it, which is obviously very nifty. And then it increases repair kit effectiveness while the barrier is up. So, you know, if you're low on health, you can drop that barrier and your medkits will be more effective. And then for Conundrum, the barrier, as mentioned earlier, is going to be larger. It's going to have a larger HP pool. It actually also increases the overall lifetime of the barrier, so it lasts longer inside of the battlefield, which can be very useful when you're trying to control the extraction points or just any point in general, point of interest. And then, most interestingly, it spawns a pillar behind the barrier that heals you and your teammates an amount of structure points per second, which is super nifty. In general, sustain abilities or passives are super viable, super important in this game, because obviously in endgames, resources start running low, as I might have mentioned earlier, and just having access to some sort of healing that doesn't come from medkits is super useful. Either way though, both of these barriers are good. I personally just play with Assess because it just allows you to do more plays, and yet again it makes you more versatile, which is also very important. And lastly, we've got the 2 minigun abilities. We've got Diligence and we've got Perseverance. Diligence increases the ability energy to 960, and it also increases it reduces the ability energy decay. Essentially what this means is that the ability lasts longer, you have more ammunition, so you know, you can just have the minigun out for longer, and critical hits increase the damage by a certain percentage, stacking up to 15%. Essentially, this just makes minigun more damage focused, more damage orientated. It means that when our minigun is up, you hurt pretty badly. But personally, I think Perseverance is just way more dominant in every field. First of all, most importantly is the first passive, which is the canceling ability refund. Essentially what it means is that if you for some reason want to retract the minigun, either because an enemy disengaged or you finished killing your opponents, you can retract the minigun and you will refund a certain percentage of the cooldown back. So instead of going back to that long 60 to 80 second cooldown, it will be reduced significantly, making it so that, you know, the cooldown is reduced, and it reduces the chances of you being killed on a third party because your minigun is on cooldown. Another passive that it has is every hit has a 20% chance to recharge an amount of energy. And then lastly, hits on the same target increase the damage by a certain percentage, stacking up to 20 times. So the longer you're shooting at someone, the more damage you're going to deal. So staying in front of this minigun passive is extremely dangerous, because minigun will melt you and will out DPS any character in the game. Alright, lastly, before just talking about the general game plan of Weaver, we're going to be talking about the best hunters, or the hunters that synergize the best with Weaver. Now, I personally think that Weaver actually synergizes with pretty much every hunter because of the fact that this hunter is relatively versatile. But either way, if I had to recommend a top 3 hunters to play with, I would say Ursus, Prophet, and Trenchwalker are your best pals. And here's why. So the main reason Weaver does well with Ursus is because your overall health to damage ratio is the highest compared to any other duo, right? The total health and damage output that Ursa and Weaver have combined surpasses that of any other duo. Essentially meaning that if you try to raw dog a 2v2, you just due to raw numbers win the trade regardless. Right? You're going to stat check any character. This essentially also, apart from that, you have the fact that you have a crazy burst damage with rockets and minigun, whilst at the same time having incredibly good defensive play, right? Because you've got Ursus's shield, and then you've got Weaver's barrier. It's just a very, very hard duo to kill overall, especially if they play their defense properly. And I think that out of all the duos in general, it's probably the easiest to play too, since Ursus and Weaver do have a relatively low skill entry per se. They're pretty easy to pick up. But yeah, either way, moving to the second duo, we've got Weaver and Prophet. Now, the reason Weaver and Prophet do very well together is because they have extremely good zone control. Prophet is capable of pushing away hunters from any position with his bombardments and drone, and then Weaver has the ability to control those zones thanks to his barrier and pretty much just, take over them. This means that you pretty much have a hunter that can take away zones and another hunter that can control them, making it super easy to take towers from opponents, control these towers, and this also applies to the extract zone. Your roll damage output is very good. Weaver's minigun deals a lot of damage over time. You also have Prophet slowly DPSing opponents through his barrages as well as his sniper shots. And the good thing about this duo too is that since Weaver has very good defensive play, he's capable of protecting Prophet, which is weak to any good burst characters, or in general, he's just very bad in close quarters. So Weaver can cover for him in that aspect. And then lastly, we have a Weaver Trenchwalker. Similarly to Ursus and Weaver, they have an extremely good defensive play. This duo is one of the best in my opinion during extract point because they have pretty much infinite sustain. They have super good zone control with the grenade as well as the barriers, and they are also extremely dangerous to approach because both of them have access to the leech gun and the minigun, which grant them very, very high DPS, making it very complicated to duel them out. So I would say these are probably the three best duels. So with that out of the way, let's move into the overall game plan with Weaver and what you should aim to do during a battle. Okay, so as a Weaver main, generally speaking, your gameplay is kind of going to revolve around what your ally is doing. Obviously, this will depend on whether your teammate is playing another glass cannon or not. Obviously, if you're playing with a Prophet or a Heartbreaker per se, you will be the shot caller, but otherwise, generally, you're always going to be there as some sort of support to just focus fire whoever your ally is shooting at, as well as deploying barriers to allow both of you to safely fire at your opponents or to simply, give yourself some cover to heal up and whatnot. Overall, make sure to always have a barrier saved. Try not to get into the habit of deploying a barrier the second you see an opponent. If you have the opportunity to just, disengage behind any sort of terrain, it's always going to be a better option than to just straight up place a barrier on reaction. It's a bad habit a lot of Weavers develop, and it just leaves you susceptible to getting rushed, especially if you're playing with another glass cannon in your team. And also this applies to your minigun. Now, your minigun should only really be deployed if you get rushed by an opponent, right? If you try to use minigun during a mid-range engagement, and let's not even get started with long-range engagements, you're not going to hit anything, but mid-range, your opponents are going to have a lot of space to just disengage and run away. You really just want to save that minigun for whenever your opponent is rushing you in. Just imagine an Ursa is coming in, Razor Sides are pushing you. Just pull that bad boy out, and generally speaking, you should be able to out DPS most hunters, especially if you've got access to your barriers, as I've mentioned before. Also very important for you to save those barriers to capture important positions, whether that is a supply tower, the extraction point, or just a good spot on the map to kind of have view of all of your opponents. It is very useful. Obviously, there's a few hunters that you're going to be looking out for, those mainly being Prophet, Fenris, and Ursa. I think those are three of Weaver's biggest counters currently. Prophet is pretty straightforward. He can just bombard you out of your barrier. This also applies to his drone, so he's going to force you to reposition. If possible, try to bait out the bombardment from the Prophet before actually setting down the barrier. This will allow you to then safely just sit down on your, behind your barrier and DPS them down for a bit. As for Fenris, the main thing you need to watch out is that Fenris's AoE attacks can damage you behind the barrier, so once you place it down, just make sure to keep some distance so that the AoE doesn't hit you. Also, they can blink over your barrier, So if they do that, just make sure that you're always at high health. Never let the Fenris lower you down so that he can't just rush you down. Either way, if he does blink behind you, you can always just dash behind your barrier again and, you know, rinse and repeat. And lastly, Ursa. Ursa is the only character that can contest Weaver at close range, right? If she pulls out armor, she can absorb all of the damage from your minigun and then just slowly damage you down with her shotgun. Sure, you have barriers, you should win the engagement, but that is assuming her teammate is not helping. This is from a pure duel perspective. If there's other people involved, obviously there's more damage going to be dealt to you and your barrier, meaning that very likely she will actually just end up killing you. So yep, that's about it. Thank you everyone for listening. Hope this little tutorial on Weaver helped you all out. And if you're interested in any other characters or any other videos about this game, please let me know in the comments. And yeah, that should be it.